In this video, I am sharing the easiest method that I've found for painting vibrant watercolor sunset skies with many different colors in them, as well as soft, fluffy clouds. Welcome to part 3 of this Watercolor Skies for Beginners series that I am creating, in which we're exploring painting different types of skies using the wet into wet technique. In part 1 of this series, I walked you step by step through painting a blue daytime sky, and then in part 2, we painted an evening sky together where we used more blues and purples and darker colors overall. And in this third and final part, we're painting a sunset sky together where we're bringing in lots of different colors, and I am sharing the techniques that I use and also must-know tips that will help you avoid creating muddiness and undesired colors in your skies. I'm leaving links to the previous episodes in this series down below in the recommended resources in case you haven't checked them out. All right, with all that said, let's jump in. All right, let's talk about the supplies that I would recommend having on hand for this sky painting exercise. I'd suggest having 2 round brushes on hand, a larger one and a medium-sized one. For my larger brush, I'm going to be using a large round wash brush, which is comparable to a size 22 to 24 round brush, but you can also use some type of mop brush. And then my medium-sized brush is a size 14 round. Anything similar to that will do just fine. And then I would also recommend having a fine mist spray bottle on hand, and this is mostly for the second half of this process. I'm only going to be bringing in 4 different paint colors for this, many of which we've been using in the other videos in this sky painting series. And these colors are Prussian blue, which is a cool blue, Madder Lake Deep, which is a cool red, Permanent Lemon Yellow, which is a cool yellow, and Payne's Gray, which is a cool gray. I wanted to keep things as simple as possible for this sky, and this is why I decided to bring in all cool colors, as we have to be really careful when we're using colors that are very different from each other or very far apart in the color wheel in one same sky. When we're painting a sky that includes colors like yellows, oranges, and reds alongside blues and purples, we want to go in with a strategy so that we can avoid creating muddy colors, which can definitely happen, especially when we overblend. And we can also accidentally create colors like green, because blue plus yellow equals green. And green isn't really a color that we want in our sky, so we definitely want to know what we're doing. And there are different approaches to this, but as I said, today I want to keep things super simple and doable for the beginner. Aside from that, I have a few of my Blue Scott absorbent towels on hand, which is the type of absorbent towel that I like using to stay on top of water control throughout the process. I have my container with water, and I've also taped down this watercolor sheet onto my black cutting mat, which I wouldn't necessarily recommend using a flexible cutting mat for watercolor painting. I would definitely recommend using a sturdier board that you can actually tilt and rotate as you go. But because I am filming and I have this whole camera set up right above me, I can't really be moving my board as I go. But definitely would recommend exploring using gravity to your advantage when you're painting, especially those larger washes, tilting and rotating your board as you go. First things first, and we need to prepare our color mixtures that we're going to be using for this first part of this process. We're going to be making more of these as we go, but we definitely want to know which colors we are using and we are mixing together before jumping in. For this one, I also find it important to know the sequence of colors that you're going to be applying. Like, what order are you going to be applying these colors in? All right, so top to bottom here, I have a puddle of plain permanent lemon yellow. Then I have a puddle of permanent lemon yellow plus a little bit of Madder Lake Deep, which created that orange that you see there. Then I have a puddle of plain Madder Lake Deep. Then I mix together Madder Lake Deep plus a little bit of Prussian blue to create a purple. And then finally, I am preparing a puddle of plain Prussian blue. And what I'm going to be doing is I'm going to be starting with the yellow, and I'm going to be making my way toward the Prussian blue, getting darker and darker as I go. So there is a sequence here. It's kind of like a rainbow, if you will. We start with the yellow, we move on to the orange, then the red, then the purple, then the blue. And this isn't to say that you can't go back to a previous color. You definitely can, but I would recommend working through the sequence initially and then doing your fine tuning, going back to a previous color as needed after you went through that sequence. I was going for somewhere around a coffee consistency as I was preparing these puddles on my palette, especially because we're going to be using the pre-wetting technique where we prepare our paper with water. So when you use this technique, the water that is on your paper is added to the water in your mixtures. So if your mixtures are very, very watery and you place those watery paint colors on paper that is wet, you're going to end up with colors that are very pale. I mean, watercolor in and of itself is going to dry lighter than how it looks when it's wet. And when you end up with colors that are too pale, you might find the need to go in and do more layering to make them even darker. And we want to avoid doing unnecessary layering because that can end up flattening everything out and can definitely end up looking overworked. So don't be afraid of going in with a good amount of color. All right, so after preparing my color mixtures, I changed my water. It is important that we do our pre-wetting with water that is clean. And what you're gonna see me do here is I'm using my larger brush to gently bring a little bit of water at a time from my container, and I'm smoothing this water on gently on my paper using vertical and horizontal brush strokes. And you're going to notice that I go over everything multiple times. You don't want to start scrubbing because that can start damaging the sizing of your paper, which I have an entire video on. I'll make sure to link to that down below in the recommended resources in case you'd like to check it out. But it is very, very important that you take your time with the pre-wetting process and that you make sure that you arrive at this nice even sheen before starting to paint in your color. You don't want any section of your paper starting to dry too fast. Once you see that nice even sheen, continue using your larger brush and start placing your first color, which is the lightest color of the bunch, which is the lemon yellow. And because this is a sunset, the sun is at the bottom, so the yellows, oranges, and reds are going to be in the bottom half, or at least most of them is going to be in the bottom half. And then the purple and the blue are going to be in the upper half. All right, I've arrived at a nice even sheen and I'm ready to start painting. I'm starting at the bottom with the lightest color of the bunch, which is my yellow. And you'll notice that I leave a little white section close to the middle of the study here at the bottom to create the illusion of a setting sun. But also notice how I am leaving small sections of my paper unpainted, and this is something that I talk about in previous videos. You want to bring in the bright paper as part of the piece. This will help you arrive at that light glowing watercolor look at the end. After placing my yellow, I created more of my orange by mixing the Madder Lake Deep with the lemon yellow, and I started placing my orange. A little bit of that orange goes over the yellow, and then you bring up that color a little bit past that yellow area. Once you place enough orange, you then do the same thing and move on to the red. Make sure that you rinse out that previous color from your paintbrush bristles before moving on to the next color, because otherwise you can end up with a very large yellow or very large orange or very large red area, and all of your colors will end up not fitting. I'm always bringing in a little bit of that next color into the previous area and then extending a little bit upward. And then I rinse out that color from my paintbrush bristles and I do the same thing with the next color. Notice how I've left little sections of paper unpainted all throughout and how everything is looking very irregular. There are no patterns here. Even though you could say I'm using more linear horizontal brush strokes, I'm always varying the pressure that I'm exerting on my brush. Sometimes just the tip of my brush is coming into contact with the paper, and other times I'm pressing down a little bit more. And this will help me create wider shapes and more narrow shapes. I want to make sure that everything is looking very irregular and very organic. At this point, things are still wet and workable because I took my time with the pre-wetting process, and I can still do more work with a clean and only slightly damp brush, whether it's lifting excess color off my paper or very lightly smoothing out textures. Maybe you see little spidery effects or cauliflower effects. You can very, very gently go over those areas to soften things out, but do your best to avoid over blending. Place your colors confidently and allow the paint to do its thing. Once you're done with any softening or lifting, as I said before, if you want to go back to any of your colors to intensify those areas or even darken them, you can go ahead and do that at this point as long as your paper is still wet. I would not recommend continuing to paint if sections of your paper are starting to dry. If that happens to you, what I would recommend doing is allowing everything to dry completely, then coming back and doing pre-wetting with clean water gently over the entire thing, and then placing more color in whatever areas you want to intensify or darken. All right, just finishing up by placing a little bit more orange here at the bottom. And it is now time to allow everything to dry completely. You're going to notice that the colors dry a lot lighter than how they looked when they were wet. I made sure to change my water. I took my size 14 medium-sized round brush, which is what I'm going to be using to paint this cloud layer. And I also grabbed my fine Mr. water bottle. The first thing that I do again is prepare the color mixtures that I'm going to be using, or at least the ones that I'm going to be starting out with, because as I move through this process, you're going to see me constantly change the ratios or percentages of my colors in my mixtures depending on the color that I want for the cloud that I'm going to be painting. So here I prepared my orange by mixing together my cool red and my cool yellow. And over here in this other half of my mixing area, I am preparing some purple. And I'm also preparing a puddle of Prussian blue with a little bit of Payne's gray so that I can make that blue a little bit darker and a little bit more muted. This second part of the process is definitely more intuitive, and you're kind of making decisions as you go based on how things are looking and what is going on in your own painting process. So I want you to get comfortable experimenting, bringing in more of this color or another color into your mixture depending on what you think will look best for the area on hand. And treat this as an exploration, as play, as intuitive work. Make sure you're not accidentally bringing in a warm yellow or your warm red or a warmer blue. Stick to the colors that we have chosen. And you can change the ratios of your colors as you go. Maybe you want to use more of a red purple. Bring in a little bit more red into your red and purple mixture. Or maybe you want to use the Prussian blue on its own without the gray. That is perfectly fine as well. Once I have my initial color mixtures ready, I get started with my pre-wetting, which this time I am using my fine Mr. bottle, and I'm no longer using my paintbrush to do my pre-wetting. I make sure to spritz enough water all over my watercolor sheet until I arrive at an even sheen. And if you see any puddles anywhere, I would recommend tilting your board so that gravity can pull that excess water down and you'll be left with more of an even sheen. Keep that water spritzer bottle on hand because you're gonna be needing it a lot throughout this process to continue wetting areas and also to maybe move your paint around a bit and create more dynamic effects. I have found that as opposed to using a paintbrush to do my pre-wetting, using a fine Mr. bottle doesn't wet things as well, or at least as evenly. So it's normal for certain sections of your paper to start drying. So keep that water bottle nearby because you're going to be doing spritzing as you go. And then you can start using your medium-sized brush to start painting in your clouds. And there is no specific order of colors to work in this time. You can just make decisions as you go. I do have the background color in mind when I am choosing the color of cloud that I am going to be painting in that area. So for example, if I want to paint a cloud in the yellow area, I'm going to go in with my orange. If I want to paint clouds in the red area, I'm going to go in with my red, maybe a red purple or a purple. And if I want to paint in clouds into the blue area, maybe I go in with a purple or a blue gray, that kind of thing. And this is so that I can avoid creating a very stark contrast, because if you paint a very dark color over a very light background, that is going to look very contrasting. You're going to see how sometimes I paint in my color and then I do my spritzing over that cloud if I want to diffuse that color a little bit, move it around. And other times I do my spritzing prior to painting in my color because I notice that that area that I want to paint a cloud in is starting to dry. Practice noticing the level of wetness of your paper as you go. I'm really avoiding painting on dry paper because I don't want to create sharp defined edges anywhere. I want soft, fluffy clouds. And if at any point I want to go in and slightly change the shape of my clouds or smooth out little textures, I make sure to go in with a clean and only slightly damp brush and very gently run my paintbrush bristles over that area. Sometimes I just do some gentle tapping, and that is enough to soften that effect. Explore bringing in different colors into one same cloud. Another thing that I make sure to do is to bring in lots of variety in sizes and shapes and the way that clouds are clustering together. It is very important to not end up with something that looks very symmetrical or too patterny, anything like that. The moment that I start noticing patterns, I stop and I try to change shapes or locations slightly, sizes, so that I can arrive at more of an irregular, organic look. And another tip is take mini breaks. See the entire study from a bit of a distance as a whole and ask yourself if more clouds are really necessary. Less is more when we're working with this medium. Have fun with this process and practice making intuitive choices as you go, depending on what you're seeing happen on your paper. Allow the paint to do its thing. Avoid going in and trying to fix any little imperfection that you see. Avoid being overly controlling. Try to let go a little bit. Do practice noticing the level of wetness that your paper has. There are definitely different levels of wetness that we can work with when we're painting with watercolor, from very, very wet to damp. But if your paper is starting to dry, that can very likely lead to splotchiness and undesired textures. You're going to notice that from time to time I bring in my absorbent towel to lift up some excess color off my paper. Sometimes because I want to lighten areas, and other times I want to change the shape of my cloud. And here I want to share what I did to get rid of that pointy kind of end to this cloud in the middle of my study here. I allowed that spot to dry completely, and then I just went in with a clean, slightly damp brush, did some very gentle scrubbing in that area, lifted with my absorbent towel, and that fixed my shape. How much color you're able to lift off your paper is going to depend on the paper that you're using and also the color's staining qualities. If the color is highly staining, you're not going to be able to lift it as easily. All right, I'm going to continue adding a few more clouds and darkening certain areas, and then I'll call this one done. Alright, I'm pretty much done here. If I continue adding more clouds, I can run the risk of just darkening the entire thing way too much, or simply adding way too many clouds. I'm happy with the variety in hues and also the range of values that I've developed in the sky. So I'm gonna call this one done. I really hope that you enjoyed the sky painting series. Thank you so very much for joining me on this one. I wish you a wonderful rest of your day. Enjoy your art practice and see you very soon.